Yes. So this is titled Contesting the Red Poppy Today, a pacifist critique of dominant remembrance commemorations. And it is basically a summary of a recent article published in Critical Military Studies. But what you get, which the readers of that paper don't get, is a number of pictures to kind of illustrate, I suppose, the various triggers for that. And so in terms of setup, I'll say a bit about the poppy's contested history, picking up from where Pete left us to some degree, kind of whizzing through the 20th century. And then I'll develop what I think are first order and second order pacifist critiques. I'll explain what I mean by that then, and then reflect on sort of to wear or not to wear the poppy, the dilemmas faced by some people today. The poppy hasn't always meant the same thing. I think that was clear from what we've heard already just now. It hasn't always meant the same thing to those who've adopted it. To some, it conveys the memory of personal and or collective suffering, lest we forget. For others, it's a respectful reminder of heroic and righteous struggles, shoulder to shoulder with all who serve. For others, still, it helps recall and warn about the horrors of war. Never again. Arguably, as others have said before me, the very capacity of the poppy to encapsulate multiple meanings and to represent different things to different people is possibly one explanation for why it has proved so powerful and resilient a symbol. And so if you whiz through the history, and arguably some of this is probably a little bit crass, and a historian will probably need to sort of unpick some of what I'm doing here, but you know, in the 1920s, originally, the poppy was seen to sort of capture the universality of bereavement in Europe post-Great War and its aftermath. It wasn't necessarily anti-militaristic, but it was, again, about the bereavement, about what had just happened. Into the 1930s, you get the kind of controversies which Pete has already alluded to with the emergence of the white poppy, which was meant to symbolize a commitment to peace alongside and a commitment to avoiding another war alongside commemoration of the grief of the First World War. But it did lead to social divisions, to tensions, to controversies. Then you get the Second World War, which arguably becomes Britain's good war and somewhat redeems the previous war. It gives meaning to the poppy. It gives a different meaning to the poppy, which will kind of survive as a vehicle to remember the fallen after the Second World War. And from then on, the poppy becomes a vehicle to remember the fallen across all the wars involving British personnel. But through the Cold War, it remains rather discreet. The funds levied through the poppy appeal stagnate to some degree in the 1960s and 70s. Where things start to change is with the 1990s, a period that has been characterized as one of sustained growth for the remembrance industry, of growing participation for battlefield tourism, a period of a new assertiveness about recollection. Moving into the 2000s with the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, 2001, 2003 onwards. Those wars were unpopular on the whole, on average, and yet despite that, there was widespread sympathy for the troops that were sent over to fight in those wars. And in the mid-noughties, you get a diverse group of politicians, military chiefs, newspapers, pressure groups launching what, I forget his name, someone has described as a militarization offensive, roughly around 2006, with various initiatives. Doesn't mean it's entirely coordinated, but you do get a number of initiatives. Veterans Day, which becomes Armed Forces Day, Help for Heroes, the Sun's Military Awards, the Invictus Games. So that by now, post-noughties into 2010s and onwards, we've entered a period of hyper-commemorative spectacle, as Withers describes, a condition of continuous remembrance, with focus increasingly on the celebration of serving soldiers, and where the act of not wearing a poppy is frequently read as a political statement as such. And so I want to show you some illustrations, as I said, which aren't available in the paper now. The vast majority of those pictures are taken from Poppy Watch, the Twitter feed of Poppy Watch, actually captured 3 years ago, near enough. And you get everything from everyday DIY remembrance, personal remembrance with some serious house and neighborhood displays like the ones you can see here. You get poppies on cars and trucks year long. On my commute into work today, I counted 5, and we're in April. Public spaces, pubs, this is just one of many. Notice the tank. Controversies around FIFA banning the poppy because it's political, which of course it is, but never mind. And then kind of tribal respect, who can outdo poppy reverence on their football shirts, rugby shirts and whatnot. You have public institutions and private corporations joining in with a kind of competitiveness about poppy performance, newspaper mastheads, Caledonian hillsides, the police, JCB. As Pete mentioned before, you can buy all sorts of things. You can buy your poppy onesie for $39.99. You can go, and this is where it becomes increasingly vulgar perhaps, but you can buy your poppy underwear, your poppy birdhouse, poppy ice cream, poppy footwear. Towards arguably even more excessive vulgarization, if that's the right term, you can get your poppy pizza, your poppy Christmas tree, your poppy wedding dress, poppy pork, to make sure it offends all the snowflakes, as I'm quoting. And again, I took this from the Twitter feed of Poppy Watch, even porn sites joining in with the poppy. But more seriously, you have paradoxical and dissonant military poppies too. Poppies on jets, poppies on tanks, poppies on ships, battleships, and you get those pictures, that famous picture at least, of children holding a giant poppy with future soldier t-shirts. The poppy becomes a symbol of belonging. The Daily Mail had a campaign encouraging those whose Britishness was probably to be doubted because of their Muslimness perhaps, to signal their genuine Britishness by wearing a poppy headscarf. Poppies on parking spaces. And at the perhaps extreme end, I'll come back to that, fascist and far-right appropriations of the poppy. Bottom left is a sort of zoomed-in version of what you have on that Vespa, where the poppy is pictured alongside a Nazi flag. What's going on? So in the paper, I develop a first order and a second order critique of the poppy. First order refers to the discourse's own terms to expose internal contradictions. The second order critique tries to reflect the broader ethical and political consequences. And together that helps me develop kind of 6 main pacifist critiques, 3 for each, if you will. First, in the first order pacifist critique, in the internal contradictions, is this narrative dissonance. In politicians and commentators preaching peace but preparing for war, you have what some would argue are role models of hypocrisy and moral depravity, preaching one thing, doing the other, showing that you can do that and rise to the top. You certainly appear to have a narrative inconsistency between the somber memory of the violence experienced in war and the exploitation of a popular symbol to promote and give ethical coating to the industry that produces war. Those jets with poppies, those children holding giant poppies with the t-shirt, future soldiers, BAE Systems, the arms industry sponsoring poppy appeals, all these things might be compatible with the interpretation of the poppy as celebrating the work of the armed forces, but is less compatible with interpretations that remember war as something to be repeated never again. And after all, are those future soldiers wearing t-shirts fully aware of the traumas of war they can look forward to carrying as veterans? At the starkest extreme of this narrative dissonance, you have these EDL demonstrators posing for Nazi salutes whilst wearing poppies, and the general adoption by neo-fascists, racists, xenophobes of the poppy as one of their favorite symbols. Yet, the fact that many victims ostensibly remembered by the poppy fell victims to such ideologies of intolerance is lost. If the poppy must carry ideological value, then arguably, I think, pacifism is a more consistent candidate ideology than, well, far-right extremism. Anyway, you have narrative dissidence, that's one point. Secondly, There's a selective memory, and again, Pete's alluded to that already, and Victoria Basham's work is helpful here too. The poppy celebrates primarily patriotic masculine heroism. It glorifies the white Tommy. It's thereby ignoring women, non-whites, and those away from the front, factory workers, food producers, ration citizens, conscientious objectors. Moreover, focusing on the heroism tends to obscure what soldiers did: killing, maiming, raping, torturing. Their role in bringing about that and the death of others is obscured when we focus on their heroism. Yet we would do well to remember British war crimes and atrocities because they are remembered by their victims and their communities. We certainly shouldn't be surprised when those communities, those descendants, find themselves offended by the poppy or the way it is used. So there's a selective memory. And linked to that, but building on it, you have this element of blinkered solidarity, which it promotes. Solidarity with the victims of violence and injustice, I think, and with pacifists, is worthy independently of the victims' proximity to us. The wartime solidarity embodied in the poppy, the valiant heroism, these are all encased in binary identities which simplify and deplete our collective memory. Selfless solidarity in the face of adversity is not an instinct limited to specific national identities. All human collectives do this. There's nothing particularly British or German to heroic behavior or exemplary morality, sacrificial solidarity. Neither were all the heroes and villains on the same side. But when remembrance of war is framed in patriotic language, the horizon of our compassion narrows, and it becomes increasingly tempting to explain the morality or immorality of particular acts of war based on who committed them rather than on the act itself. It limits our understanding of human nature and identity. To remember war sacrifices is of course legitimate and important, but why not accommodate also and just as prominently the memory of actors and victims on other sides? I'm not sure the poppy as currently commemorated does that, or as with all the poppy and the commemorations it conveys and performs. Those are three first order pacifist critiques. A second order critique, and I'm borrowing this framework first, second order from Richard Jackson, who will intervene tomorrow in the seminar tomorrow. Second order critique entails looking beyond the internal consistency or inconsistency of a discourse to reflect on the broader political and ethical consequences of what's going on, who benefits. And here, first needing a mention is the military-industrial entertainment complex. Poppy commemorations present tempting opportunities for financial profit, improved moral stature, and electability. Plenty of actors in the military-industrial entertainment complex can therefore exploit poppy commemorations. The poppy brand is valuable. Poppy commemorations are also an opportunity to polish the national brand. The British national myth that armed forces, though strong, are only deployed when necessary, even though Britain has waged wars more frequently than most other countries. And so British military interventions have been legitimized as benevolent and humanitarian, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, or to uproot terrorist threats, Afghanistan, or as aimed at protecting the international community from rogue regimes, Iraq, Libya. Poppy commemorations do not hinder such recurrent interventionism. They seem to facilitate it. Pacifists instead would rather ask us to denounce not just the act of killing, but also the social practice of war, the political economy of war making. War is something that needs to be prepared for. Constant military preparedness produces a military-industrial entertainment complex. The way we commemorate past wars can help or hinder that process. The way the poppy is used to convey remembrance today doesn't seem to hinder it. Second point here is around diplomatic posturing. Heads of state, foreign policy elites like to pose for memorial diplomacy on key wartime anniversaries. But the memory that is maintained tends to be framed within national and local imaginings, primarily instrumentalized for diplomatic benefits, such as to reaffirm commitment to European integration or to the transatlantic military alliance. The various liberal international institutions that have proliferated since the Second World War and that seem to be justified by the way we commemorate the poppy might have pacified relations between countries in the global north, but wars driven by geopolitical and neocolonial motives have continued regardless in the rest of the world and led by the global north. If the solemn commemoration of past wars does not nurture some searching critical analysis of our collective history and of our own participation in ongoing acts of violence, then what will? The poppy, as we currently remember it, doesn't seem to be encouraging that. We can also question whether the sacrifices remembered in poppy commemorations actually achieved the goals which poppy-wearing elites put forward to justify them. Did the dozens of British military interventions since the First World War deliver security, either for UK citizens or people in the countries involved? Did they prevent the independence of British colonies? Did Britain's various counter-hegemony campaigns improve the socioeconomic conditions which fostered rebellion? Have recent wars against terrorism defeated the threat of terrorism? Have they brought stability and prosperity to Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya? These kinds of questions pacifists would like us to look at. Finally, there's the question of charity for veterans. Veterans are remembered on Remembrance Day, but complain of being ignored or largely ignored by political elites the rest of the time. Post-traumatic stress disorder is common, homelessness and suicide rates among veterans is high, NHS support for discharged personnel is not sufficient. But quite aside from that, why should it be left to philanthropic charity, the philanthropic charity of the many, for funds to be raised to help veterans instead of ensuring that the state for which they killed and died provides them with enough support? Moreover, framing this as charitable care reproduces an image of the troops as victims of something that appears like an agentless calamity, as if there was no agency behind it. Poppy commemorations have evolved to become, at best, compatible with British militarism, at worst, complicit in it. In the process, never again has been increasingly sidelined. The wearing of the red poppy has become a compulsory ritual in British civil religion for all public figures. To fail to join in is to be marked as a heretic, unpatriotic, disrespectful. This patriotism is also, it's worth noting, both top-down and bottom-up. That is, on the one hand, the performance ritual, as you can see in that image behind, is coordinated by the Crown, the armed forces, politicians, the media, the church, cultural icons, and of course, the Royal British Legion. But it's also, on the other hand, enthusiastically supplemented by countless expressions of everyday and mundane nationalism, examples of which I gave you earlier on. This poppy patriotism is furthermore promoted from cradle to grave, deliberately by the RBL and others. It's also an increasingly emotionally charged affair. Dissent is increasingly difficult. It becomes disrespectful to question whether these victims should have been sent to die and kill. The increasingly hegemonic narratives around the poppy therefore function to mute the voices that beg us to reflect on the deeper causes of war. In other words, pacifists are made to feel they do not belong. The moral duty to remember, I think, pacifists, think, is only partially fulfilled if it does not include at best a commitment, at least an openness to reflecting on the causes of war. Pacifists feel most ostracized by the red poppy nowadays. An alternative poppy will probably continue to feel necessary for them. Whether commemorations can become more inclusive of deeper critical reflections on British wars, past and present, is primarily for the guardians of the red poppy to decide. Meanwhile, those inclined to pacifist critique will in turn continue to decide, come Remembrance Tide each year, whether their inclinations are compatible with the red poppy.